Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. Last time we looked at David Hume and his empiricist approach to how we gain knowledge. We gain it through the five senses, he said. And then the time before that, we were looking at Descartes, and we looked at Berkeley as well. And as we looked at those two and their idealist response to the idea of here's how we gain knowledge, we gain it primarily through our understanding of ideas. The mind supplies the knowledge. Today, as we look at Immanuel Kant, and let me just say that it is pronounced Kant. Even if you're from Oklahoma or Arkansas, it is not pronounced Kant. It is pronounced Kant, just so you know. With Kant, what he's going to do is he's going to try to take the two and blend them together. He's going to say it's both and. They're both necessary. You can't gain knowledge only through one, only with one. You have to have both of them, and they're going to be working together in order to give us some kind of knowledge. And so he's going to try to, I'm going to say, marry these two theories together for us. And so if you've been sitting there patiently or impatiently waiting for someone to finally say maybe it's both, well, Kant is going to be your guy. So Kant, just a little bit about him kind of quickly. Kant lived in Prussia, not Russia, Prussia. He lived in a place called Königsberg, and it is said that he never traveled more than 50 miles from his home, but he lived there for his entire life, and he was somewhat unknown for quite some time, but he is going to become a mind that is going to be very, very brilliant, and that all the world is going to have to try to deal with and to answer some of the questions and objections that he's going to raise to both empiricism and to idealism. Originally, Kant was an idealist, or in this case, a continental rationalist. And remember, I said that idealism and rationalism are the same thing. The idea is that you're using your mind for both of them. You have ideas in your mind, and you have a rational mind. And then empiricism and materialism are the same thing as well. So those two things, two different words for the same things. And what happened in Europe is that the continental rationalists really were comprised of the philosophers who lived on the continent of Europe, and they were the ones who were championing idealism and rationalism, whereas we found the empiricist camp was almost completely stationed in Britain, and so they were called the British empiricists. And so what you've got is this battle between the philosophers on the continent of Europe, the continental rationalists, and on the island of Britain, you've got the British empiricists, and they're going to argue with each other about these two particular positions of where knowledge comes from. And so Kant is originally going to be a continental rationalist. After all, he does live on the continent, so that shouldn't be surprising. But he is going to eventually be, he said, roused, is the word he used. He's going to be roused from his dogmatic slumber by reading David Hume. So he's an idealist who begins to read an empiricist and begins to recognize that Hume and empiricism do have something to offer. And so he's going to be roused. He said, I'm going to have to change my mind about a couple of the things that I'm thinking. And so as he's reading Hume, he begins to change the way he thinks about epistemology, the way he thinks about how we begin to get our knowledge and our understanding. Kant is difficult to read, and he's difficult to read partly because he only wrote in German, and I don't speak German. But even in German, he's hard to understand. He is going to be rather wordy, and he's going to give us a lot of new vocabulary. He's going to invent some words that we try to have to wrap our minds around. What is it that he means when he says ... deontology or something like that? He's going to give us these kinds of words that the people at that time are not going to be familiar with. And so trying to understand exactly what he means sometimes can be very, very difficult. And some of my professors have said that people have dedicated their entire lives to trying to understand this man, and they're still not entirely sure what it is that he's saying, because his thoughts can be very, very complex. And they are highly developed, but they are, again, very, very complicated. Kant was impressed by some of the works of Hume and by what Hume was saying with his empiricist ideas, but he began to think about, as he began thinking about what Hume was saying, what the empiricists were saying. Remember, I was talking about how the empiricists said that that humans were a blank slate, that when we came out there was nothing written on us. And Kant, as he begins to read Hume, he begins to question whether or not we can truly come out purely as a blank slate, or if there must be something else that's happening inside of us that kind of goes along with the five senses. And so what Kant is going to say is that it's true that all of our experiences come to us through impressions, and they come to us through sensations, but that's not to say that there's nothing else in there. All that is to say is that all of these experiences come to us through our five senses, but he's going to argue that we have to have something in the background, again, making sense of these. Remember us talking about in the discussion on Berkeley, that there has to be a knowing, processing mind. And Kant is going to stick with this idea that there has to be that knowing, processing mind that's behind it. He said, yes, all knowledge is gained by experiences, but there has to be a mind that's using those experiences and generating, that's through its operations, that it's having an understanding and putting them together into some kind of composite that allows that we understand what's happening around us. Kant is going to try to counter this idea that all knowledge comes to us through the five senses by saying, yes, it comes there, but there's more to it. There's something else that's happening behind it. He's going to claim that the empiricists are accepting this. They're accepting the five senses, but they're ignoring this part over here. They're ignoring the idea of that there is a process that allows that event A happens, event B happens, and when it does, that allows me to understand, this part allows me to understand event A and event B following each other and happening. It's not through your five senses that you come to associate. Remember Hume's parade theory and association theory. It's not through your five senses. Your five senses cannot allow you to associate things together. That's nothing that they can do. They can see event A and they can see event B, but they cannot associate, because association is nothing that can be done, nothing that can be experienced through your five senses. You can't taste association. You can't hear association. You can't see it. Now that's the tough one. You can see the two things happening, but you can't see association any more than you can see cause on the billiard table. Remember us talking about that last time with Hume. You can't see cause. Well, you also can't witness association. Kant's going to say that's got to be something that comes from your mind. And so the empiricists are going to argue, Kant is going to say they're going to assume that the mind was purely passive, when obviously there is a processor that's in there that isn't passive, rather it's very, very active. And Hume's going to say, Kant is going to say that this processing mind, this active mind, is nothing that you could have gained an understanding of through your five senses. Nobody saw the active mind, or heard it, or smelled it, or felt it, or the one I missed. Nobody did that with your five senses. It's something that you have, that you understand, but none of us learned that we are that kind of being through our five senses. Rather, we understand that that really is something that we have, and it has to have always been there from birth. There has to have been a processing mind that was active and not passive. All right, Kant also argues that the mind cannot be passive, since humans have made progress in the natural sciences. And what he means there is that if science were left up to the senses alone, it would be impossible, because while we could see and hear and smell things, part of the scientific process is prediction, and you can't predict something just using your five senses. There has to be a processor back here that's saying, okay, yes, we saw event A followed by event B followed by event C, which means then I can repeat it. And so I'll bring about some type of manufactured event. where event A happens and then event B and then event C, and I can predict that with some type of regularity, that as long as I produce event A, I can predict that event B, C, and D will follow. And then if I do it again, that's the scientific process, right? We do it over and over and over again. As long as I can produce A, I can predict that B and C will follow. Prediction, though, is nothing that you can know using your five senses. Kant says it has to be something that comes to us through this active knowing, processing mind. So science itself would be fully and completely impossible unless there is that knowing, acting, processing mind, and the knowing, acting, processing mind did not come to us through the five senses. And so Kant concludes that it was something that's always been there. It has to have been there prior to it being given to us through the five senses. And that word prior is going to be important. It's going to come back. It's going to come back up here in just a second. So this type of reasoning, Kant's type of reasoning here, is going to give us two new terms. It's going to give us the term a priori and a posteriori, right? And instead of trying to write it on the board, I refer you to the notes for the spelling. Remember that the A in front of each word is part of the word. So you'll have A space priori and then A space posteriori, right? But it's part of the word. So a priori knowledge is knowledge that is completely independent of the senses, and it comes prior to the senses. Now, I'm kind of try to help you get a picture here with a priori and a posteriori. A priori, you can just hear the word prior in. And so if something happens prior, that means it happens before. And so in this case, it happens before the five senses. You get some type of knowledge before the five senses bring it to you, right? And a posteriori knowledge contains the word post, right? Meaning that something happens after. And so I always talk to my students about their posterior. Their posterior is the last thing that leaves the room as they're walking out. It's the caboose. It's the last bit. It comes after everything else. And so a posteriori knowledge is knowledge that comes to you after the five senses bring you that knowledge. And so what Kant is going to argue here is that humans have both of these kinds of knowledge. They have a priori knowledge and they have a posteriori knowledge as well. They have knowledge that's there before the five senses bring it, and they have certain kinds of knowledge that are there because the five senses bring it, and it can only be there after the five senses bring it. So he's going to say that a priori knowledge, the prior knowledge, is pure. That is to say that it's not brought to us by the five senses, and it's nothing that the five senses can reveal to us. And that's why he calls it pure, because it has nothing to do. It stands alone apart from those five senses. And so it's going to be pure knowledge within that category. So within that category, we'll talk about a few things. I'll talk about those things now. There's going to be a couple of different things that he's going to say with a priori knowledge that our five senses can't bring us. So, for example, he's going to say that there are two things on the billiard ball table that we talked about with Hume, with regard to Hume, that are pure, that we can't know through our five senses. We know them, but we don't know them through the five senses. Those two things are going to be time and space. Think about it for just a moment. Your five senses don't supply you with your sense of time. Now, we have a sense of the movement of time and time moving around us because of physical objects that we see. And so the sun moves in the sky, and we understand that as time, or a clock has hands, and that as the clock's hands move, we watch those physical objects moving around the clock face, and we have an understanding of time moving forward because of the physical objects that are moving in a measured way. But time itself is not contained in the clock. It's not contained in the clock face, and it's not contained in the clock hands. Time itself is not included within the sun or within our earth, as the two of them do what they do in order for us to have the understanding of the passage of time. Time itself is not included in any physical object. With water clocks, we have sand clocks. All of these different things, time is not part of the physical makeup of those things. And so since it's not, it can't be witnessed or understood or experienced through the five senses, And then, so what Kant is going to argue here is that time is going to be something that's purely mental. It must come to us purely through a rational process and through a mental understanding of the world that has nothing to do with the five senses. And so we have the understanding of time because it's pure, it's on its own. You can't witness time on the billiard table with your five senses. That's nothing you can do. Also space. Now we understand that we move around in space, but space itself is nothing that we can witness with the five senses. And I'm not talking about the air that is within the space that I am in at this moment. I'm not talking about that air. I understand that that is something that I can have a sensation of with my five senses, right? That different things are happening within the space, within this atmosphere. But what Kant is talking about here is purely the understanding of space itself. There are physical objects in the space, but he's not talking about those physical objects. He's talking about space itself in which the physical objects reside. But the concept and the understanding of space itself is purely mental. You can't know space. You can know physical objects in space, but you can't know space using your five senses. So you can't witness time and space on the billiard ball table using your five senses. That's something that must come to you purely through the mind. You also can't know, Kant is going to say, you can't know all through the five senses. You can know singular, you can know plural, but you can't know totality. That is to say, you can't know all, because all you can know through your five senses is one. And so, for example, the marker here is easy. I have one marker. We can understand that. Singularity, a marker. We can know plural markers, and so we can understand, three. Now I'm the Count from Sesame Street. We can know three markers. I have three markers. We can know plurality through our minds. Through our five senses. But we can't know totality through our five senses. That is to say, we can't know all. We can't know all through our five senses because we haven't witnessed with our five senses all markers. And since we haven't witnessed all markers, we can't know all markers using our five senses. Instead, what happens is that using our five senses, using our mind, we realize that there are a plurality of these, and then our mind comes to understand all markers, right? But you can't do it using your five senses. It's got to be something that comes to you through your mind, through a knowing, processing mind. There are others. I'm going to leave the others for now. Only just to say that there are these others that are going to be pure. They're going to be a priori. They're not going to be something that's included that you can learn through the sensation of the mind itself. Through the sensation of the five senses themselves. Although I do want to mention one thing, for example, here as well, because I think it's particularly telling. One of the things that you can't know through your five senses is infinity. Again, this idea of this number that is so large that you can't add another to it. That's got to be something that is known to you because of your mind, and purely because of your mind, because infinity is not a number. And so the old joke is that the hard empiricist, the one who's dogmatic about their empiricism, is the person who believes that infinity came to be understood by somebody counting to it, when we know that there is no number so large that you can't add one to it. And so infinity is purely conceptual. It's not that anybody can count to it. You can't know infinity using your five senses. It's purely something that comes from the mind. And apparently I lied because I wanted to give you another one here as well. There's something called modality, in the sense of that you can know that something is. You can know that something does exist, but you can't know that something is necessary. Now, what I don't mean is that you understand that something's necessary in order for you to live. Oxygen is necessary for you in order for you to live. But that's not what I mean. That's not what Kant meant either. what he's trying to say is that you can't understand something as being necessary with your five senses. You can witness that things are a certain way, but you can't have the understanding of things being necessary unless you're doing that through the knowing, processing mind. So that's something else that you have to have through the mind, not through the five senses. If all you had were the five senses, all you would know is the way things are. You couldn't know that and ... is necessary, right? And so there are some things that are a priori. That is to say that they come to us first through our minds, and we have knowledge of them through the mind, and it's nothing that the five senses gave us. Time, space, infinity, necessity, those types of things are things that have to come to us through the mind itself. Now, Kant is going to say then that the other experiences, the one that comes to us through our five senses, this is what he called a posteriori knowledge. And in this case, a posteriori knowledge is knowledge that you have to get this knowledge through your five senses. You can't get it through the mind itself. And so, for example, can you tell me, using just your knowing, processing, rational mind, can you tell me if Bill's shoes are tied? Right? Not only can you not tell me if Bill's shoes are tied, using just your mind, you can't tell me if Bill's shoes are tied. You can't even tell me if Bill even has shoes, just using your processing rational mind. In order for you to know if Bill's shoes are tied, you have to walk into the room where Bill is, look at his feet, and figure out if Bill has on shoes, and then you can figure out if Bill's shoes are tied. But you can't know that minus the five senses. And so what Kant is going to say is that it takes both. If we're going to walk around in this world, we have to have both of these things in order for us to make sense of the world and to truly gain any kind of knowledge. We have to be using this, and we have to be using this. And the two of them have to be working together, and they have to be working together well. So he believed that in order for us to truly have any kind of knowledge, we could not simply have empiricism or rationalism, but it's going to take the combination of both of them together. Kant used rationalism and empiricism when working together to solve a problem. Cause must be understood as coming through the mind, right? Remember the billiard table? I almost feel like Hume kind of knew what he was doing, and he said, well, we don't see cause, but the brain infers it. That's kind of a sneaky little move there where, well, if it's not supplied by the five senses, it's supplied by the mind, which means that that knowing, processing mind must be necessary, and it didn't come to us through those five senses. It's almost sometimes like Hume kind of tried to sneak it through without people noticing. But that cause has to be understood through the mind as well. In other words, there must... and so part of what Kant argues for here is that unless you have the mind out there working, then when the five senses brings information into the body, imagine that a body that doesn't have a mind, that doesn't have a knowing, processing mind, sensations come into the body. What does the body do with that information? It just gets bombarded by, say, a bright light or by some type of overwhelming smell, whether it's good or bad, it doesn't matter. It gets bombarded with that, but what could the body do? How could it possibly respond? And I say this, that you would almost be like a zombie, kind of wandering around, bumping into different things, because you wouldn't have a mind to process the information as it came in so that you could avoid objects. You would be being bombarded by your five senses, but if there's not a knowing, processing mind behind it, trying to make sense of those experiences, then Kant is going to say, well, that's nothing that that's nothing that's going to really help us. We're just going to be being bombarded by those experiences that are happening all around us. And so by the same token, though, Kant came to understand that the mind itself needs the experiences, needs the sensations that come to us through the five senses, because if the mind were just there processing minus the five senses, what would it be processing? And Kant says it might be able to reflect on its own existence, but it wouldn't be able to reflect on anything else because it wouldn't be having any kind of experiences, because those experiences come to us through our five senses. And so you have to have the mind and the five senses, because without the five senses bringing you something, your mind is a computer just sitting there thinking about itself, so to speak. They didn't have computers, but so to speak. So Kant says it takes both. You have to have the five senses coming in and the computer that's processing them all together in order for us to get any kind of knowledge or understanding or perception of the world that's around us. Now, Kant also said that you have to have a continuous stream of consciousness, that you can't do what Hume is talking about in his parade theory. Kant says that we don't have this kind of experience. We don't really see event A, full stop. Event B, full stop. Event C, full stop. Event D, full stop. We don't do that. That's not the way our mind works. We don't have this kind of herky-jerky, A, B, C. We don't have that kind of experience. Instead, what we have is a smooth, continuous, I'm going to say streaming. Now, they didn't have computers. They didn't understand streaming videos. But if you've ever done this, we have this smooth, streaming experience where our mind doesn't have event A followed by event B, followed by the march of C, followed by the march of D. And instead, what we have is that. So Kant says we don't have this kind of herky-jerky experience. We have this kind of smooth experience, which means that our minds don't operate in that kind of Humean parade theory, associative theory. Rather, we are constantly processing, and we move through the experiences smoothly, flawlessly. We stream from one experience to the other. So it takes a knowing, processing mind, and it takes perception through the five senses. For there to be any kind of, there has to be input data, but there has to be some kind of critique, some type of rational, something happening on the inside. The input has to come in, the data has to be processed, and Kant brings these two sources of knowledge together, the a priori and the a posteriori knowledge. He brings them together and he says, and that's how humanity works. We use both of these. So it's important that we combine them and that the two of them work together. And with Kant here, you can kind of see how that's necessary, just in the sense of that. Imagine that if we turned off some of your senses, you're going to have a harder time. People who are blind are going to have a more difficult time than people who are going to be seeing. Or if your processor isn't working as well as other person's processors, think of somebody who's in an epileptic fit. Their processor is not functioning as well as someone whose mind is not having a seizure. So you've got to have these two kinds of things working together. They both have to be healthy, and through that type of a conjoined operation where they're going to be working together, that's how we have the experiences that we have, and that's how we gain knowledge, and that's how we gain understanding. So with Kant, kind of that overview, kind of that the pulling them together. Hopefully some of you are sitting there saying to yourself, finally somebody's saying, it takes both. And again, if that's something you're after, Kant is definitely your guy. Now, when we come back next time, we're going to be looking at William James and his pragmatism, and I think many of you will like what James has to say as well.